Building a pivot table. In this how-to video, I'm going to show you how to build a pivot table and some of the basics and the components to the pivot table builders. So as you can see here, I have a table of data. When creating a pivot table, you always have to start with the raw data, since the purpose of a pivot table is to summarize data. In this table, I have 9,996 rows. I don't want to analyze that by hand or by creating formulas, so I'm going to use a pivot table to do it for me. To create a pivot table, you click inside your data table, anywhere, just one cell, and choose Insert, Pivot Table. It will automatically select the table for you. You can adjust that range if you want, but I know that mine goes down to 9,996, so I know mine is correct. Then it tells you where you want to put the pivot table. You can, by default, put it in a new worksheet, or you can choose Existing Worksheet and click on a cell where you want the upper left corner of the pivot table to start. I usually give myself a buffer of at least one row and one column to the above and to the left, and press OK. A placeholder will appear and it tells you to build a report. Choose the fields from the pivot table list. Let me move my screen in a bit so you can see that. And here is my pivot table field section. You'll notice that all of the headings across my table, when I click in the pivot table, these are the actual field names in my pivot table builder. So we go from order ID, ship mode, and the idea of a pivot table is to be able to drop and drag the pieces and have all of the data fill in for you. If for some reason you don't see your field builder, click on your pivot table and go up to either Pivot Table Analyze or Design. That should pop up. If my window was wider, you would see it. And there's a button here called Field List. If you click on it, it goes away. It's just a toggle. You click on it again and it comes back. So just in case that doesn't pop up automatically, that's where you can find it. Now let's look at an example, because that's the easiest way to show you what a pivot table does. So let's say we want to find the number of orders in each category. So I have my categories here, and I want to list all of those categories and count how many orders are from each category. So I know I want to list the categories, and in my case I want them to go down the left side. So I want one to say furniture, and one to say office supplies, and one to say technology, so on and so forth. So I'm literally going to scroll down, grab category, and drag it into my rows section. So anytime you take a category, a field, and put it into the rows section, it becomes labels down the left side. One thing that I find helpful that I actually just learned, instead of saying row labels up here, that's kind of annoying, if we go back up to this field builder section and we click on Design, instead of showing report layout, if you click the drop down arrow and put Show Outline Form, it will automatically include what the actual heading is for you. That's really helpful when you're building a pivot table. So I have my categories, and those are furniture, office supplies, and technology. That's all it does. If I wanted to compare something else, maybe regions, I'll uncheck that box, or you can drag it back up and it goes away. So now I'm going to use region and drag that down. Now you can see that the region appears as the heading, and all of the regions within that category appear down the left side. That's all the rows do. They just kind of put those headings and the categories, or the data types, down that row. Now for the actual data, because of course I want to count how many of these fall under each of the regions, this is where our sum values come in. And sum values are literally the data. What data do you want to show? In this case, I want to count the number of orders in each region. So I am going to go up to Order ID, click on that, and drop it in the sum values section. And I can see that it tells me there are 2,323 orders in the central ID 2848. Right, it counts them for me. That's it. This is like doing a count if for each of these, except it's drop and drag. So it's so much easier. By default, anytime you drop something into some values that is not quantitative, so if it's not a weight or a height or a measurement of some sort, by default it always comes in and counts it. How many times is there an order ID for office supplies? Each time it sees one of those that coordinates, it just adds one more and does it automatically. Now what's interesting and a little confusing at first is all that counting is doing is saying there is a record with that information in the category or in the region. So we actually could use just about anything to count. We don't have to count the number of order IDs. We could come back and actually click on region and put that for our sum values. And it's going to give us the same values because those regions come up the same number of times in the table. So when you're counting, you have a lot of flexibility on what you use for your sum values. I'll show you another one. So if I made it customer ID, it gives me the same values because it's just telling me, again, how many rows have a region with these in these categories. That's it. Let's start another example. And while I'm here, I want to show you, I'm going to click on this and try to delete it. It's going to give me an alert that says you can't change part of a pivot table. It will not allow you to do that. Just don't even bother. But what you can do is highlight an entire pivot table and delete it if you want. So we can start a pivot table from scratch, or you can create a pivot table over another pivot table, but you can't delete part of a pivot table. It's all or nothing. So I am going to click back again, starting with my raw data table. I'm going to insert another pivot table. And that flew off the side of my screen, sorry. I'm going to use the same range. I'm going to put it in an existing worksheet again. Press OK. And this time, oh, everything popped back up. That's good. This time I want to show you what happens with the columns. So we know the rows will give us the heading, and then it will show us the actual repeated data as the list in the row. But what happens with the columns? So let's check it out. Let's go up to, what do we want to show? How about we do the regions again? So I'm going to do regions in my rows, and that will show up down the left side. I am going to go up to my design tab and change the report layout to outline form so it shows me my headings, just to make it a little bit easier on myself. So here are my regions, and now I want to show the regions, and I want to show the shipping modes for each region. So in the central, how many of the orders shipped second class, and how many of the central orders shipped standard class? So if I grab my shipping mode and take it to my columns, those will be the headings that show up across the top of the pivot table. So you can see the shipping mode is the heading, and I have first class, same day, second class, standard class. If I were to get rid of region, if I were to click on region and get rid of that, and I wanted shipping mode to go down the left side, I could put shipping mode over there, and I could move regions across the columns. So again, whatever you move to the rows section goes along the left side, and whatever you move to the column section goes along the top of your pivot table. That's the easiest way to remember how to build them. Then in this case, I just want to count them. Again, I can use, well, pretty much any of these. I'm going to go ahead and use order ID, and it will now count. Okay, there were 299 first class packages sent from the central region, or to the central region, 490 from the east, 234 from the south, so on and so forth. You can format, and I do highly recommend formatting your data nicely in a pivot table to make it easy to read. So you're allowed to do that. You just can't delete one cell from here. All the formatting you can still make pretty. And now it's really easy to see, all right, here are the count of order IDs. That's a little funky, so maybe I would say number of orders. So I'm going to click in this top part, and type number of, orders. And now I know what my table's all about. I know these are the regions, and I know this on the left side show my shipping modes. So now I have a count of where those intersect. You may now be thinking, hey, that's a lot easier than creating all of those COUNTIF functions to find data, and absolutely, it absolutely is easier, but it does come with one drawback. If for some reason you come over here and oops, somebody put this region in incorrectly, it was really supposed to be north, not south, that data does not automatically update in your pivot table. You can get it to update, but you have to click on your pivot table and go up to your pivot table analyze, and there's a section that says refresh. You can refresh the data, or you can refresh all. I almost always recommend choosing refresh all because it will refresh all of the pivot tables made from that data. And now you will see that it did update the values. All right, so there's one north. There wasn't a north before, it actually added a north. So you can see that it did include north and updated the table, but I had to do it manually. So when you use a COUNTIF function and reference all of the cells, it automatically would update that. A pivot table is easier to build, but you have to refresh the data manually. You can see now that I have a table that's slightly adjusted because I have added sales and postal code into this particular table. I want to insert a pivot table again, so I will grab my pivot table option. Sorry, that's off the side again. I'm going to put it up here again. The location isn't necessarily important, for this example anyway. But what I do want to show you is this time I want to take and show data from my regions. So I'm going to grab my regions and I want those to go down the left side. So I'll put them in the rows section, and now all the regions show in the rows. I am going to jump up to the design section and show an outline form so those headings show up properly. Okay, so I have my regions down the left side, but this time I want to show the total sales in each of those regions. So I'm going to scroll until I find sales in my pivot table field, drop it in, and what it did automatically is Excel is super smart, and it said, I think this might be a quantitative value, because it probably saw the dollar signs and went, okay, these may be dollar amounts. That's a quantitative value. That's something I can add together. So by default, when you drop something that Excel deems a quantitative value in the sum values, it makes it a sum instead of a count. So when you drop something that has words like furniture, office supplies, that's qualitative, a category or a descriptive data, it puts it in as count. When it finds something it thinks is quantitative, by default it chooses sum. Now you can change this. So I'm going to scoot my screen in just a little more. There's a little I button next to this, or a drop down arrow, or you can right click and choose field settings or click on that I. Again, either will work. It gives you lots of options. Okay, you can rename it. So if I don't want sum of sales, if I want it to say total sales, I'll put total sales in here. But the other thing is, if you don't want it to be a sum, if you want it to be a count, or maybe I want the average of those, I could make it average and press OK. And now it shows up as, well, oops, total sales, but it gave me the average sales for each of those regions. That's like doing an average ifs, but all you had to do was press one button and choose a new setting. So I'm going to go back in. I'm going to make it sum because I do want the sum sales. Press OK. Alright, so sum of sales, and it changed it back again. You can change the title up here too. Total sales. But you know, now that I'm thinking about it, having the average sales would be really helpful. So I'm going to click back on my pivot table. That keeps flying away, sorry. I'm going to take sales and I'm going to put it down on the sum values again. And it's going to give me the same thing. But this time I don't want it to be the sum of sales. I want it to be that average. So I'm going to click that button and choose field settings, or click that title so this pivot table field pops up. And now I'm going to choose average sales as my field name, and I'm going to click on average and press OK. So I have now the sum ifs, essentially, the sum values in this column and the average values in this column, plus it automatically totaled them for me. You can change the totals on or off by clicking grand totals, and you can make it turn it on and off for rows or columns. That'll always be specified for you. But that's way easier than doing the sum ifs or average ifs when you're using a large data set and you just want a summary table. So again, pivot tables summarize the data really easily for you. The drawback is that it doesn't automatically update if you change the table, but the bonus is it's drop and drag to build. And again, I could go in and format my values the same way you would any other Excel value. So maybe I take away the decimal places. This puts it pretty nicely, and your pivot table would be complete.